Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right, so I picked a text that I chose for a variety of reasons. This is a text that's useful in making some points that I'm typically apt to make when teaching Indian philosophical and religious texts, and Buddhist ones in particular. But I also picked it, and I particularly picked it, and I'll go up to this point, because it also is useful for, it doesn't explicitly make this point, but it's a useful text in conversation with which to make a point that is, I think, very important for religious studies in general. One of the points that I think philosophical reflection can particularly contribute to religious studies. And certainly one of the points that it would be most important to me to make somewhere along the way in any course introducing religious studies. So that's what I have in mind in picking this text as I did. Not quite sure whether I will be talking to you about how I would teach this, or whether I will end up just teaching. I'm not sure there would be a difference between the things. The student Elsner said in office, I was once that he really liked my teaching method, and my thought was, I didn't know I had a method. I thought I'd talk about stuff. All right. Among the many things this text exemplifies, and in the state in which we have it, and also in the things behind the English translation here. And I apologize for the bizarre sort of PDF. When this was due to Lucy Pick, I realized in the last minute that my own copy of this was too heavily annotated to scan. It would be embarrassing. And this was all I could download electronically. But not only because of the bizarre and not very user-friendly character of the PDF, but also because of some things very typical of translations, modern translations of Indian philosophical texts. There are a variety of things about this that make it immediately not very user-friendly, and that point to some of the many respects in which texts like this are indeterminate. So, for example, you see lots of stuff inserted in brackets. That's owing to some very characteristic kinds of ellipsis that are typical of Sanskrit philosophical texts. Very often, but not always, these bracketed insertions will be supplied from commentaries. And even when done well, though, it can be an alienating sort of experience. Just the graphical difference it makes can make it hard to read things smoothly. And the characteristic kind of ellipsis is owing partly to the fact that these texts are verse texts. This is a verse text with an auto-commentary. And of course, the reason the root text is written in verse is that it's easily memorized. And a lot of the ellipsis that is characteristic of these texts is owing to the fact that the ideal readers of the text can be expected to have memorized them and lots of other stuff besides. So there are lots of ways you can refer to whole lists of things and without ever actually having to refer to them. And the ideal user of this text can be expected already to know it. We are not the ideal users of this text. And appreciating that fact about a text like this is an important thing to appreciate. We are yet further removed in that this is an English translation from the Tibetan translation of a Sanskrit text that was not known to survive in Sanskrit when this translation was done. Though it has since been recovered in China and is being edited and going to be published in this joint publication series between Beijing and Vienna. So your point about modern politics. Apparently the diplomatic shenanigans involved in a joint publishing venture between Beijing and Vienna are not to be believed. It's going to be about 15 years before this comes out. So we're looking at an English translation of a Tibetan translation of a Sanskrit text that's already hard to read in the Sanskrit because of these characteristic features of these texts. But an English translation from a Tibetan translation that is itself still used today. There are still communities of Tibetan Buddhists. There was a talk last week about traditional Tibetan Buddhist education and the difference between that and modern education. And this is among the texts that figures most prominently in their curriculum. So to this day, there are thousands of Tibetan scholastics who will have memorized this very text in the Tibetan from which this is translated. And the verse quality of these, I never cease to find astonishing. Imagine if you were challenged to adduce the ontological argument for the existence of God or the trans-transcendental deduction of the categories, but do it in iambic pentameter. And among the things that can be most problematically and frustratingly indeterminate about texts like this is that even such basic things as which voice in a dialogue is represented by which verse or which portion of the verse can very often be extremely difficult. And it makes a big difference for understanding a text whether you read a sentence to express the view that's being argued for or the view that's being argued against. And so you see artifacts of the translator's attempt to make sense of that here too, inserting, chat, objection, response. That's not always in the text. And the commentarial tradition itself will often find these things indeterminate, and Muslims exploit that fact. So lots of things typical of the indeterminate character of the kinds of things that we start to work with, and it's certainly among the points I want to make in teaching these things, that we appreciate these. And then we appreciate, related to us, how very differently the people whose texts we're interpreting relate to the texts of their tradition than we do. And then we can even possibly appreciate. Okay, to say what I had in mind in bringing this text to the conversation, I can't avoid saying a little bit about the philosophical position that it represents. So this is a text that's called the Madhyamaka, the Introduction to Madhyamaka, by the 6th or 7th century Indian Buddhist Chandrakirti. Commentators taken as by most Tibetan schools of thought as representing the pinnacle of Indian Buddhist philosophy. Chandrakirti is the definitive statement of Buddhist philosophy for most Tibetans to this day. Madhyamaka, like all of the traditions of Buddhist philosophy and of Indian philosophy more generally from the first millennium of the Christian era, this is an eminently scholastic tradition of thought, in the sense that, in common with all of the Sanskrit traditions of philosophical thought, commentary on received texts was the primary mode for thinking philosophically, for thinking creatively, for receiving and understanding the tradition. So the Madhyamaka school of thought is one that takes its bearings from a 2nd century thinker named Nagarjuna, one of the most studied and elusive and interesting figures in Indian philosophy. And you can see evidence of the basically scholastic character, evidence of the idea that, and this is maybe preeminent among the things it means to characterize a tradition as scholastic. There's the view here that everything we need to know is already presented in the tradition, and what is prized, therefore, is in skilled philosophical work, is not novelty, but adequacy to the tradition. So works almost invariably represent themselves as the best interpretation of what we Buddhists already all agree to be true. Which is not, however, to say that there can't be and wasn't enormous creativity and novelty. This is a point about how they represent what they're doing. They invariably will represent what they're doing simply in terms of interpretive adequacy to a received tradition. But they do so constantly under the pressure of challenges from rival traditions and in ways that unfold over time. And the tradition, no tradition, is self-interpreting. So each new generation of thinkers finds itself presented with something that it takes to be the received wisdom, takes to be what we have to understand, But then they have to go about understanding it, and they have to go about that in light of a few generations of back and forth with rival schools of thought. So Chandrakirti is coming to this 400 years after Nagarjuna started the Madhyamaka tradition of philosophy. And in the intervening period, there have been lots of challenges, lots of developments in Pan, Sanskrit, logic, and epistemology. And so there's always going to be often enormous novelty and creativity and truth. And perhaps especially at this period. So Chandrakirti is writing at a time when really there's suddenly an explosion in the creativity and sophistication of Indian philosophy more generally, owing largely to the sudden emergence of a shared vocabulary for characterizing arguments. And this is something actually introduced by other Buddhist philosophers. So suddenly you have a sort of consensus about how, in principle, to characterize valid arguments and a shared vocabulary for characterizing kinds of inference and whatnot, which suddenly makes it much easier to be challenged by other schools and to be responsive to those challenges. So it really puts traditions in conversation with one another to a new extent. And the explosion in output and in sophistication of output exemplifies something else that I'm apt to say in teaching really philosophy in general, but especially philosophy in scholastic religious traditions like this, which is that what it is to do philosophy in these traditions, it seems to me, is to think systematically about what all you are committed to in virtue of believing whatever you believe as a function of this tradition. So it's in other words, to think systematically about what is entailed by the characteristic claims and positions of your tradition. And one of the things that the hermeneutic philosophers get really right is the idea that texts are always characterized by a surplus of meaning. Well, this is a good way to make sense of why it's as we should expect that texts are always characterized by a surplus of meaning. Because what a text means is a function of everything else that's entailed by what it means. So one way to say what it would mean to thoroughly understand the text or the claims of a tradition, what it would be to really understand that would be to understand everything else that follows from that, everything else you have to be able to explain in order to make sense of that. And that can only be worked out over the course of generations. Nobody can be aware at the time of writing any text what else is entailed by what they say. And when traditions suddenly are able to be in conversation with each other in a way and to an extent that is really flourishing at this time period, is suddenly thinkers in these traditions are pressed to a new degree for the entailments of their claims. So how do we make sense of this given our cardinal commitment to doctrine X, Y, and Z? And always, in every step along the way, the arguments are always going to be represented as interpretively adequate to the tradition. So we see Chandrakirti say in here that all along the tradition has developed by reference to scripture and reason, yukti and agama. So he's in verse 3 at the first page of the selection, locating himself in the Madhyamaka lineage. He says, the approach to be explained here is established in accordance with the original way of the noble Nagarjuna. Nothing I'm telling you is new. Nagarjuna got it right. Because he comprehended the profound nature of things through reason as well as through scripture. And there's a very typical recognition that what you have to do is appeal to both of these. Though a lot of these thinkers at the end of the day think that yukti, or reasoning, is ultimately the most important of those, because scripture is only valuable as understood, as interpreted. How do you know what counts as a good interpretation? We have to use philosophy to do that. Okay, so a teeny bit about the Madhyamaka school of thought, and a little bit by way of making sense of the second page and following. The cardinal doctrine of Buddhist philosophy, the doctrine that all other Buddhist philosophy is about, the doctrine whose entailments guide everything else in the tradition, is the doctrine of selflessness, the doctrine that we are not selves or do not have selves. We are not enduring autonomous things. And that is a thing that had been quite variously unpacked in the philosophical tradition. And in the philosophical mainstream of Indian Buddhism, the way to unpack that was to take the challenge as being, well, if we aren't selves, if there aren't selves, then what is there? So one philosophical test you could think you have then is, well, let's catalog the kinds of things there are. Let's create a complete fundamental ontology and elaborate all the ontologically basic kinds of things there are, and show how those things can interact in ways that produce the illusion that there are selves. So in modern philosophical parlance, the mainstream Indian Buddhist project was reductionist. They were into elaborating the basic parts to which being a person could be reduced. And the most basic term of art for talking about the ontological primitives here is dharmas. We're very familiar from religious studies in general and the study of Indian religion, peculiarly Buddhist usage of that word, though. So there's this literature in which dharmas refer to the ontologically basic, irreducible parts that are all that are really real. So there's a strong tendency in the tradition to affirm that wholes aren't real. And again, where selves would be the paradigm case of a whole. There is nothing over and above the series of fleeting sensations that you are aware of at any moment. Introspectively look for yourself. You won't find anything. All you'll find is this sensation or this one. And no one of those things makes sense as what you really are. And they're all causally contingent, and they're all fleeting, and each one is only present when its causes are present and vanishes when they're present. But, according to the mainstream philosophical tradition of Buddhism, we can catalog those kinds of things. We can say what kinds of things, what kinds of most basic things there are. Okay? And that's comparable in some ways to modern scientific understanding. So the Abhidharma philosophers would say, we can give you an ultimately true account of what there is and what we're like. You think that you are an enduring self, but the really ultimately true description is that there are simply these causally continuous series of momentary events, et cetera, and here are the kinds of events there are. Okay? That's all background to the Madhyamaka tradition, which deeply resists this way of talking, and resists this way of talking because the Madhyamaka insight, Nagarjuna's insight, is that if you think that those dharmas are really real, then you've compromised the basic insight of the tradition, which is that nothing is really real. Everything is dependently originated. You can't make sense of the idea that the explanation ever comes to rest and that we can reach the bottom of the pile and be sure that, well, we know there aren't selves, but we can be darn sure this kind of thing exists. And Nagarjuna says, no, that's missing the whole point. There isn't anything like that at all. Not selves, but not these irreducible dharmas either. So this is a school of thought that's in the business of canvassing a whole range of explanatory categories, mostly from the Buddhist tradition, but also from other Indian philosophical traditions, and invariably showing that they're incoherent, invariably showing that any category you care to pick, causation, motion, sense faculties, consciousness, any category you pick will turn out to disappear under analysis. It will turn out not to be ultimately real. It will turn out only to make sense relative to something else. Nothing will count as being at the bottom of the pile and as the one kind of thing that's ultimately real. And so you see that the very characteristic kinds of arguments in verses 8 and following in the selection I gave you. So this selection starts, this part of the text starts by considering causation, and in a very characteristic Buddhist fashion says, well, if causation is really real, then it has to be of this sort or that sort. Causation, things that arise causally have to arise, well, either from themselves or from something else. And just to be really thorough, the Madhyamaka tradition says either from themselves or from something else or from both or from neither. So we consider all four possibilities. And none of them make sense. So the idea is if you consider that none of the conceivable ways in which things would have to be related if they're going to be causally related, if none of those make sense, then that category doesn't make sense. And so we get these arguments to the effect that, for example, it would be entirely pointless for an entity to arise from itself, and it is moreover unreasonable to suppose that something already produced might be produced all over again. Very characteristically unuser-friendly English translation of a Sanskrit text. The argument here is that if something were to arise from itself, then it would already have to be present to be the thing from which it arose. But in that case, the question of its arising can't any longer be asked or answered. What's the sense in saying that? A little bit more difficult is when he then turns, verse 14 and following, to the more intuitively plausible idea. Well, maybe then things originate causally from other things, which students are apt to agree with. And that, he says, doesn't make sense either. He says, if one entity arises in dependence on another, then pitch darkness can arise from a flame. In fact, if this were the case, then anything could arise from anything, because it is not simply the case, the cause, which is different from its effect. All non-causes as well are different from that effect. Anybody understand that? Anybody got some questions with me? The argument there is, well, if otherness is a criterion for being a possible cause, then you need some principled way to determine which other things could count as causes. And there isn't any principled way. So another standard consequence will say, well, if being other than the effect is sufficient to be a cause, then a coal could give rise to a sprout just as well as a seed could give rise to a sprout. The coal is other than the sprout. So, whether or not it's a good argument, we can appreciate the characteristic style of argument here, which is, in this school of thought, very characteristically, simply to show the absurd entailments of holding any of the positions that they're considering. So that invariably seem to argue that all manner of unwanted, manifestly self-contradictory or incoherent consequences result from any conceivable position you could hold the subject. Okay? All right. Now, what is perhaps most important to appreciate about Madhyamaka and its sense of how it differs from other Buddhist schools of thought is as follows. The Nagarjuna's worry, Chandrakirti's worry, the Madhyamaka worry, is that if you say, with the rest of the mainstream Buddhist tradition, if you say that there are no selves, but I can tell you what there really is, we can enumerate the kinds of things that really do exist, then you've just explained away the entire level of description at which the Buddhist path makes sense. Because the whole project of eliminating suffering and developing compassion for suffering beings, that whole idea is an idea that only makes sense relative to selves and persons. So the Madhyamaka worry is, and it's again this parallel to contemporary philosophy of mind, where there's the reason to worry that consciousness or subjectivity might be completely explained away if we could but achieve a sufficiently complete neurocognitive scientific account of what there is. Same kind of worry. And the middle way these guys want to strike is to say, yes, it's true that there aren't cells. It's true that we can analyze cells and find that nothing withstands scrutiny, nothing's left. But the point of doing so isn't to realize that there's therefore nothing at all, and that suffering and rebirth and whatnot don't matter. The point is to realize that none of those things are real in the way we think they are. But that's not to say they're completely non-existent, full stop. So what this approach amounts to is a kind of recuperation of our common sense intuitions, and a recuperation, therefore, of the whole level of description at which the very idea of the Buddhist path makes sense. A recuperation of the level of description that makes it possible to talk about suffering selves and developing compassion for them. Okay? So this brings us then to what there is in the text in these few pages that I most wanted us to appreciate. Namely, verses 4 and following. So back to the sort of introductory section. And I should back up and say one thing more here. One thing distinctive of this text is that this is a series of Madhyamika arguments that are indexed to a series of traditional stages on the path towards enlightenment. The Buddhist tradition is maddeningly replete with lists of different kinds of things, and among many different lists are the 6 perfections you have to develop and the 10 bodhisattva stages and kind of whatnot. The chapters of this text all correspond to these categories on the path to enlightenment. So we are in chapter 6, which is the 6th bodhisattva stage. And among the ideas here is that you can only understand the ideas of this chapter if you have first worked through the ideas which correspond to the stages of development of all the preceding chapters. It's also interesting, though, that it's this chapter that it's a work in 10 chapters, but this chapter is the one with all the philosophy. This one is the chapter that also corresponds to the perfection of wisdom. So this is the chapter where he does philosophy. There are a couple other chapters after this with 5 or 6 verses where they're almost like throwaway chapters. This chapter has like 200 verses and engages countless schools. This is the one he really cares about. But it begins, nevertheless, with these sort of verses of homage. And these are the things I most wanted us to consider. Okay? So, verses 4 and following. He says, even as a common man, one may hear about emptiness and experience an inward joy again and again, his eyes moistened with tears born from that joy, and the hair on his body standing erect. The seed of a perfect Buddha's discrimination lies within such a person. This person is a proper vessel for teachings on reality. It is to him that the truth of the highest meaning is to be taught, and he possesses the qualities which must accompany that instruction. Skipping to the last. A person who is expert in this profound and vast way, who has by degrees obtained the stage called the joyous, and who is intent on this stage, he alone should attend to this path. Okay? All right. Now, and he elaborates on a lot of this in the commentary. Only somebody, he says, who's wept with compassion, or wept with joy at the thought of the Buddha's fathomless compassion. Only someone who's been moved that way can possibly rightly understand the arguments I'm about to make and the claims I'm about to give you. And if this were a course on Buddhist philosophy, I would emphasize some of the typically Madhyamika reasons for it being important for him to say this kind of thing, because in line with the point I was just making about this school as trying to effect a recuperation of the sort of personal level of description, it's within that context that these thinkers will find it important always to keep compassion in view. If you think you can explain away persons and explain that all there is these fleeting impersonal events, then how can you possibly make sense of compassion anymore? And we know that compassion always has to be in view, so you must have misunderstood the point of all this if you made compassion impossible. Okay, so there's a characteristically Madhyamika reason to think that we have to first cultivate great compassion before we can understand the highest teachings. Only that way will we preclude or foreclose a nihilistic understanding of the claims that are about to be made. All right? To me, the more generally significant point, and the point that I think is significant for religious studies in general, is this idea that's evident here that you have to have cultivated certain virtues before you can develop a certain kind of gnosis or understanding, a certain kind of philosophical understanding. That philosophical understanding is really only fully available to somebody who has first constituted him or herself as the right kind of moral agent, who has first constituted the right kinds of virtues. Okay? And the point I want to develop in the last few minutes, and that I think would be among those I would find it most important to bring into, of course, on introducing religion, is that we need to appreciate that understanding that point, understanding the importance or desirability or necessity of first cultivating certain virtues before it's possible to understand something, that point is not mutually exclusive of his nevertheless making claims that he's proposing as really true and making arguments that he proposes as sound arguments for that point. So, in other words, recognizing the importance of cultivating psychological or anthropological features of ourselves as prerequisite to understanding truth isn't mutually exclusive of making sense of the idea that there is an objective truth of the matter that we can make sense of. Okay? And this is a point that's recognized in lots of religious traditions. The philosophical point I have in mind here is one that will admit of a variety of theological interpretations or unpackings. So the Christian idea of the sensus divinitatis gets at the same point I want to have us appreciate. So that idea, the idea that only certain people have, owing to grace or whatever, being cultivated as properly receptive to the truth, that is a way that the tradition can explain things such as why one person is and another is not moved by an argument. And a way of making sense of that, while also making sense of the argument as sound and as issuing in a true conclusion. So you can say, well, this is a sound argument for a good conclusion that's really true, but I can explain why you're not persuaded by it, and why you're not being persuaded by it doesn't count against its truth. Well, it's because you are not predisposed to see truth in the right way. But we can recognize that point and still think that, well, it's real truth that they're after here, and we can understand the idea. On Buddhist reckoning, the same sort of idea would be characterized in terms of the need to eliminate afflictions, or progress on the Buddhist path is typically represented not so much in terms of accumulating knowledge as it is in terms of eliminating cognitive and affective afflictions. You know, the idea that, well, we're all basically wired to see things as they really are, but we're prevented from doing so by the countless lifetimes we've spent habituating ourselves to these destructive and self-serving ways of understanding things. And if you could just eliminate those habits, you would see things as they really are. Okay, so lots of traditions have conceptual resources for making sense of this idea that the claims of the tradition are proposed as really true, And we can make arguments that we can show you are really sound for the truth of those arguments. But we can also make sense of why, despite the soundness of the arguments and despite the truth of the claims, some people are never going to be persuaded of them. Okay? And philosophically speaking, I'm apt to say that one of the points that's reflected in this kind of insight is the difference between truth and justification, where truth is an objective status. If something is true, it's true whether or not anybody believes it. A stock example in history of philosophy is that the morning star and the evening star both refer to the planet Venus. Well, when that irrelevant astronomical discovery was made, it didn't only then become true that those were both the same thing. It was true all along. What changed was what people were in a position to think. So truth is a normative objective status. What we want to be true doesn't make things true. Whether or not we believe something doesn't matter in regard to whether something's true. Justification, in contrast, is a fact about us. Justification refers to an epistemic status. Justification refers to facts about how or whether we're entitled to think something is true. And these two things, truth and justification, go together closely, because what it is to be justified in believing something is to be entitled to think it's true. But they also come apart, importantly, because what I'm justified in believing can change. So things that Euclid was justified in believing about geometry, we might now recognize as not true. But we wouldn't say that what was true had changed. We would say that what he was entitled to think was true changed. Well, these ideas, the idea that you need a sensus divinitatis to be moved by arguments for the existence of God, or that you can only really understand arguments about emptiness if you have first wept at the thought of the Buddha's compassion. These psychological or moral virtues, these are facts about our epistemic situation. These are facts that have to do with the possibility of our being justified. But that doesn't have any effect on the idea that what we're justified in believing might be really objectively true. That's a different kind of thing. All right? That's one. The point I would then have us appreciate, which I think is quite significant for religious studies in general, perhaps especially as it's been done in the last few decades, is that this philosophical point is applicable in the context of a lot of social scientific and other theoretical approaches to the study of religion. So, just as there's no contradiction in thinking that, no, things really are empty of essence in just the way Chandrakirti proposes that is really true, even though you're not in a position to appreciate it. There's no contradiction in recognizing both of those things. In the same way, we can recognize that with Bruce Lincoln, for example, that religious traditions are a function of the self-interested behavior of actors competing with one another for resources and legitimacy and circulating texts and claims that advance their own interests. We can recognize all that, but also recognize that those kinds of considerations don't preclude or foreclose considerations about the possible truth of religious claims. So for the same kinds of reasons that I tried to give you in too short a time here, social scientific and other analyses of how religions as a psychological or empirical or historical matter of fact do tend to work are logically distinct from questions about whether the claims of these traditions might be true. And exploring the former doesn't have any bearing on the latter. It can be owing to the hegemony of social formations and institutional status and whatnot that I was raised to believe such and such. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether, for all that, the claim might be true and whether there might be sound and interesting arguments made in support of it. So that's what I see as available in this text.
Thank you for that. I thought it was really interesting. I thought that is one thing entry into the imperial true religion should be, right? I had a question about the last point, though. So I'm fully on board with what you say about the truth, justification, distinction, instruction is really important. But it also struck me that there's a different way to read the relevant point about virtue as a precondition for entry, right? So one version is you're just not going to get it. You're not going to understand this unless you've acquired and formed in the relevant virtues. A different way to put it is you might understand it, but it's just going to reinforce your viciousness if you approach this first, right? So you might, you could make this point in an intro to religion class, right? So if you're the vicious sort of person who's coming here just to look for material to talk about why every other religion is full of barbarians or something, then all the things you're going to learn here are going to be put to bad use. So if you're that kind of person, you shouldn't enter, right? Unless you've got certain kinds of epistemic virtues already up and running, right? This class is only going to reinforce your viciousness, right? It struck me that there's a parallel point here about how knowledge can reinforce vice, and that would be one of the reasons to recommend starting with this stuff unless you've acquired the relevant virtues.
Yeah, I think that's complementary to the point that
I didn't think you pulled it off. I was just curious.
And one response is to say that, well, if you understand these in such a way as to further your own self-interest and whatnot, then you haven't properly understood them. Another way to put it is to say that what's being emphasized here is the difference between understanding in the sense of simply assenting to certain propositions. Yeah, I understand modemic arguments for emptiness, or I'll give you one. The difference between that and being transformed by them.
Right.
And this is a tradition that thinks a transformative insight is achievable. And anybody who, however skillfully they handle the arguments, is still a jerk or otherwise manifests failure to be compassionate. And if a person hasn't been changed by them, if only at a superficial level, that we're in the business, we Buddhists could say, of uprooting deeply held, deeply habituated afflictions that where the sort of cognitive ones that go with right understanding are just the tip of the iceberg.
Thanks very much, Dan. I really think that in an introduction to religion class, it's really important, as you've learned, that the relationship between philosophy and religion both be introduced and problematized, right? So and so one needs definitions at some point. And I wonder, as an educator, like kind of when that happens. I also really agree with you, I think, on the basic point from this material, that the relationship between authority and argument are embedded here in a tensive way. And I think that this source does a really nice job of laying that out. I just wanted to point to another definitional issue for all of us, and that's the relationship between religion and magic, and just exegetically by reference to paragraph 56, which came kind of as a surprise to me in this very, this is a text of empiricism. Paragraph 56, this is a footnote 56? But it's a quote.
Yeah, I give you endless. Many of which are quoting from the autocon.
Okay, well I hope this is about the magician?
Okay.
Where an analogy is made, which I took to be a logical analogy that requires the actuality of a magician being able to create a magical creature. And I wondered, so where's magic in this scheme that seems so hyper and wonderfully rationalized?
Well, this is a very frequently used metaphor, actually, in this tradition. There's a sort of standard list of 7 or 9 metaphors of something we're talking about. The difference between how things really exist and how they seem to us to exist. And we'll say, well, reality is like an illusion, like bubbles, like foam, like a magically created illusion. And presumably those, a lot of them are immediately intuitive, but for that to be as intuitive as the others, presumably there has to be some experience of or familiarity with the idea of really persuasive conjuring or something. But apropos the authority thing too, one point I often make in teaching philosophy of religion is to problematize the question of what's the difference between philosophy of religion and theology. And on one hand, it seems inevitable that you're going to say something about deference to authority, but that can't be the right explanation completely because people are deferential to authority in philosophical discourse. Well, is it a certain kind of deference to authority or answerability to tradition? Well, it seems right to say that, but it's hard to get clear on when does it stop being philosophy and start being theology. But one thing that's clearly evident in a text like this is adequacy to Scripture is a sine qua non. If you cannot represent what you're arguing as the best interpretation of Buddhist Scriptures, it's not a good Buddhist argument.
I think we should break now. We have about 12 minutes till we can finish. And then we'll start again with our last meeting.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.